presidente Barack Obama.
Mr. President Barack Obama,
Nos complace recibirlo en la primera visita de un
we are
mandatario
pleased
de los
to
Estados
welcome
Unidos
you on this,
a nuestro
the
país
first visit
después de
of a
88
President of the
años.
United States of America to our country in 88 years.
Constatamos que en los 15 meses transcurridos,
We have observed that
desde
in
que
the 15
anunciamos la
months that have
decisión de
passed,
restablecer
since the
las
decision
relaciones
was made
diplomáticas,
to establish our diplomatic
hemos obtenido
relations,
resultados concretos.
we have obtained concrete results.
Reanudamos el correo postal directo
We were
y
able
firmamos un
to
acuerdo
resume
para
direct
restablecer
postal
los vuelos regulares.
exchanges, and we
Hemos ampliado la
signed
cooperación en
an
áreas de
agreement
interés
to
mutuo.
resume commercial flights.
Suscribimos dos
We have
memorándum de
signed
entendimiento
two memorandums
sobre
of
protección de
understanding
medio ambiente
on
y
the
áreas
protection
marinas
of the environment
y otro para mejorar la
and maritime
seguridad
areas,
de la
and another one
navegación
to
marítima.
secure the safety of
Hoy se
sea
firmará uno
navigation.
más
Today, another one will be
sobre
signed
cooperación en la agricultura.
on cooperation in the area of agriculture.
Actualmente
At the moment,
se está negociando otro grupo de
another
instrumentos
set of
bilaterales
bilateral instruments
para
are being
cooperar en
negotiated
esferas como el
to cooperate in
enfrentamiento
such
al
areas
narcotráfico,
as counter
la
narcotics,
seguridad del comercio y de los viajeros
the
y la
safety
salud.
of commerce and travelers
Sobre
and
esta
health.
última,
About
hemos
these
acordado
last issue,
profundizar la
we have agreed to
colaboración
deepen our
en la
cooperation
prevención y tratamiento
in the
de
prevention and treatment
enfermedades transmisibles
of transmissible
como el
diseases
Zika
such as Zika
y de enfermedades crónicas no
and
transmisibles,
non-transmissible chronic diseases,
incluyendo el cáncer.
cancer included.
Esta cooperación es beneficiosa
This
no solo para
cooperation
Cuba
is
y los
beneficial not
Estados
only for
Unidos,
Cuba and the United
sino
States,
también para nuestro
but
hemisferio.
also for our hemisphere at
A
large.
partir de las decisiones adoptadas por el
Following the
presidente Obama
decisions made by
para
President
modificar la
Obama
aplicación de algunos
to modify the
aspectos del
application of
bloqueo,
some aspects of the blockade,
empresas cubanas y sus contrapartes
Cuban enterprises
estadounidenses
and their American
trabajan
counterparts
en la identificación de
are working
posibles
to identify
operaciones comerciales
possible commercial
que se
operations
pudieran concretar
that could
en el
materialize
marco aún restrictivo
in the
de
still
las
restrictive
regulaciones
framework
en vigor.
of existing regulations.
Algunas se han materializado
The fact is that
especialmente
some have
en el
already
área de las telecomunicaciones,
materialized, especially in the area of
ámbito
telecommunications,
en el que nuestro país
an
cuenta
area
con un
in which our
programa
country
basado en sus
already
prioridades de
has a
desarrollo
program designed
y en la
on the basis
necesaria
of its
soberanía
priorities
tecnológica
and the necessary
que
technological
garantice el
sovereignty,
uso apropiado de estas
one that can
al
secure their
servicio
appropriate
de los
use
intereses
at the
nacionales.
service of national interests.
También se avanza en negociaciones para la adquisición
Progress
de
has also been
medicamentos,
made toward the acquisition
equipos
of
médicos
medicines,
y equipamiento
medical material,
para generación de
and
energía y
equipment for power
protección del medio
generation
ambiente,
and environmental
entre
protection,
otras.
these among others.
Mucho más pudiera hacerse si se levantara el
Much more
bloqueo
could
de
be
los
done
Estados Unidos.
if the U.S. blockade were lifted.
Reconocemos la posición del presidente
We
Obama
recognize the position
y
of
de su
President
gobierno
Obama and his
contra el
administration
bloqueo
against the blockade
y los reiterados llamados que ha hecho al
and his
Congreso
repeated
para
appeals to
que lo
Congress to have it
elimine.
removed.
Las últimas medidas adoptadas por su gobierno
The most
son
recent measures
positivas,
adopted by his administration are
pero
positive,
no suficientes.
but insufficient.
Intercambié con el presidente sobre
I have
otras
the
medidas
opportunity
que
to discuss with the
pensamos
President
pueden
other
tomarse
steps that we
para
think
eliminar
could be taken
restricciones
in
aún
order to
vigentes
remove
y hacer
restrictions that
una
remain in
importante
force
contribución
and
al
make a significant
desmantelamiento del
contribution to
bloqueo.
the debunking of the blockade.
Esto es esencial porque el bloqueo
This is
continúa
essential
en vigor
because the blockade
y
remains
tiene
in force
componentes disuasivos
and because it
y
contains
efectos
discouraging elements and
intimidatorios de
intimidating
alcance
effects and
extraterritorial,
extraterritorial outreach.
sobre lo cual le expuse algunos ejemplos al
I put forward to the
presidente
President some
para
examples
mostrarle sus
on this,
consecuencias
showing
negativas
their
para
negative
Cuba y otros
consequences
estados.
for both Cuba and other
El
countries.
bloqueo es el obstáculo más
The
importante para
blockade
nuestro
stands as
desarrollo
the most
económico
important obstacle
y
to
el
our
bienestar
economic
del pueblo
development and the
cubano.
well-being
Su eliminación
That's why its
será
removal
esencial para
will be of the
normalizar las
essence
relaciones
to normalize
bilaterales.
bilateral relations.
También será beneficioso
And
para la
actually, it will
inmigración
also bring
cubana
benefits
que desea lo
to the
mejor
Cuban
para
emigres
sus
who wish
familias
the best
y
for
sus
their
países.
families and their country.
Para avanzar hacia la normalización,
In order to
también
move
será
forward towards
necesario
normalization,
que se devuelva el
it will
territorio
also be
ilegalmente
necessary to
ocupado por
return
la base
the
naval de
territory
Guantánamo.
illegally occupied by Guantanamo Naval
Ambos
Base.
temas, por ser los principales
Since
obstáculos,
they stand as the two main
fueron
obstacles,
abordados
these issues
una
were
vez
again
más
dealt with
en el editorial publicado
in
el
the
9
editorial
de
ran
marzo
on March
pasado
9
en el órgano oficial del
by the
Partido
official
Comunista de
newspaper of the
Cuba.
Communist Party of
Y
Cuba.
hace solo 4 días,
And again,
en la
only 4
conferencia
days
de
ago,
prensa de nuestro
in
canciller
the press conference
Bruno
offered
Rodríguez
by our Foreign
Parrilla,
Minister Bruno Rodriguez,
ampliamente divulgado
both
por la
pieces
prensa.
extensively reported by the media.
Asimismo, otras políticas debieran ser
Other
suprimidas
policies should also be
para que pueda
abolished
haber relaciones
for normal
normales entre
relations
Cuba y los Estados
to develop
Unidos.
between the United States and Cuba.
No debiera pretenderse
No one
para ello
should intend
que el pueblo cubano renuncie
to
al
have the
destino
Cuban people
que libre y
renounce the
soberanamente ha
destiny
escogido
it shows in freedom and
y por el
sovereignty,
que ha hecho inmensos
the same for
sacrificios.
which it has made enormous sacrifices.
Intercambiamos además sobre temas
We
internacionales,
also discussed international
en
issues,
particular aquellos que
particularly
pudieran afectar
those
la
that could
paz,
have
la
an
paz
impact
y la
on
estabilidad
regional
regional.
peace and stability.
Especialmente estaba previsto y no hubo tiempo para
We had thought
concluirlo.
to discuss other issues, but we did
Era
not have enough
abordar
time.
nuestra preocupación
I had planned
por la
to raise our
situación de
concern over the
desestabilización
destabilization
que se intenta fomentar
some
en
are trying to
Venezuela,
promote in Venezuela,
lo cual es
something
contraproducente
which
para
we
el
consider to
ambiente
be
en el
counterproductive
continente.
to the overall
Pero
situation
lo
in the
expreso en esta
continent.
ocasión.
I did not have the chance to raise it with them. I'm raising it
Igualmente,
here.
dialogamos sobre la
Likewise,
marcha del
we
proceso
talked
de paz en
about the ongoing
Colombia
peace process
y
in
los
Colombia
esfuerzos para poner
and the
fin a
efforts
este
to put an
conflicto.
end to that conflict.
Existen profundas diferencias
There are profound
entre nuestros
differences between our
países
countries
que no van a
that will not
desaparecer,
go away,
pues tenemos concepciones distintas
since we hold different
sobre
concepts
muchos
on many
temas,
subjects,
como los modelos políticos,
such as political systems,
la democracia,
democracy,
el ejercicio de los derechos
the
humanos,
exercise of human rights,
la justicia social,
social justice,
las relaciones internacionales,
international relations,
la paz y la estabilidad
and world peace
mundial.
and stability.
Defendemos los derechos humanos.
We defend human rights.
Consideramos que los derechos civiles,
In our view,
políticos,
civil,
económicos,
political,
sociales
economic,
y culturales
social, and cultural
son
rights
indivisibles,
are indivisible,
interdependientes
interdependent,
y universales.
and universal.
No concebimos que un
Actually,
gobierno no
we find it
defienda y garantice el
inconceivable
derecho a la
that a
salud,
government does not defend
la
and ensure
educación,
the right to
la
health care,
seguridad social,
education, social security,
a la alimentación y al desarrollo,
food provision
el
and
salario
development,
igual por
equal
trabajo
pay,
igual y los derechos
and
de
the
los
rights of
niños.
children.
Nos oponemos
We
a la
oppose
manipulación
political
política
manipulation
y el doble rasero
and double
sobre los
standards
derechos
in the
humanos.
approach to human rights.
Cuba tiene mucho que decir y que
Cuba
mostrar en
has
esta
much to say
materia
and show
y por
on
ello
this issue.
le reiteré al
That is why
presidente
I have
nuestra
reiterated to the
disposición a
President
mantener el
our willingness
diálogo
to
que
continue
iniciamos.
moving forward with the dialogue on this
El
matter
pasado
that was
17
already
de
initiated.
diciembre del 2014,
On December 17th,
cuando anunciamos la decisión
2014,
de restablecer
as
las
we
relaciones
announced the decision to
diplomáticas
reestablish diplomatic relations,
debemos aprender el
I
arte
said
de
that we
convivir
should learn the
de forma
art of
civilizada
coexisting
con nuestras
with our
diferencias.
differences in a civilized manner.
El 15 de julio del 2015 hice ante nuestro
In my remarks to
Parlamento
Parliament
señalé
on July 15, 2015,
cambiar
I said,
todo lo que deba ser
changing
cambiado
everything that needs
es
to be changed
asunto soberano y
is the
exclusivo de los
sovereign
cubanos.
and exclusive concern
El
of
gobierno
Cubans.
revolucionario
The revolutionary
tiene la
government
disposición de
is
avanzar
willing
en
to
la
advance to a
normalización de las
normalization of
relaciones,
relations,
convencido de que ambos
for it is
países
convinced
podemos
that both
cooperar y
countries can
coexistir
coexist and
civilizadamente
cooperate
en
in
beneficio
a
mutuo
civilized manner
por encima de las
and for their
diferencias
mutual
que
benefit,
tenemos
regardless
y
of existing
seguramente tendremos,
and future
y
differences,
contribuir con ello a la paz,
and thus
la
contribute to
seguridad,
peace,
la estabilidad,
security,
el desarrollo y la
stability,
equidad
development,
en nuestro
and equity in our
continente y el
continent
mundo.
and around the world.
Hoy ratifico
Today,
que debemos poner
I
en
reaffirm
práctica
that we should
el arte
exercise
de la
the art
convivencia
of civilized
civilizada,
coexistence,
que implica
which involves
aceptar y respetar las
accepting and
diferencias
respecting differences
y no hacer de ellas el
and
centro de
preventing
nuestra
these from
relación,
becoming the center of our
sino
relationship.
promover
We
vínculos
should
que
instead
privilegien
promote
el
links
beneficio de
that can
ambos
benefit
países y
both
pueblos
our countries and peoples,
y concentrarnos en lo que nos
while
acerca
focusing
y no
on
en
those
lo que
things that
nos
bring us
separa.
closer and not on those that pull us apart.
Coincidimos en
We
que nos
agree
queda por delante un largo
that a
y
long
complejo
and complex
camino por
path
recorrer,
still lies ahead.
pero lo importante es que
But
hemos
what is most
comenzado
important
a dar
is that we have
pasos
started taking
para
the first
construir
steps
una relación
to
de
build
nuevo
a
tipo,
new type of
como la
relationship,
que nunca ha
one that
existido
has never
entre Cuba
existed
y los
between
Estados
Cuba
Unidos.
and the United States.
Destruir un puente es
Actually,
fácil
destroying a bridge can
y
be
requiere
an
poco
easy
tiempo.
and quick undertaking.
Reconstruirlo
However,
sólidamente
its solid
es
reconstruction
una tarea de mucho
can
más
prove a lengthy
y larga, es
and
mucho
challenging,
más larga y difícil.
a lengthy and challenging endeavor.
Después de 4 intentos fallidos,
After 4 failed attempts
en una muestra de voluntad
and
y
giving proof of her
perseverancia,
will and perseverance,
el 2 de septiembre
on
del
September 2,
2013,
2013,
la nadadora estadounidense Diana
American swimmer
Nayat
Diane Nyad
logró cruzar a nado
managed
el
to cross the
estrecho
Florida
de la
Straits
Florida
swimming
sin jaula
without an anti-shark
antitiburones.
cage to protect her.
Para esa hazaña
For that exploit
de vencer la
of
distancia que
conquering
separa
the
geográficamente
geographical
a nuestros
distance
países,
between our two countries,
o por esa hazaña, el 30 de agosto del
it was for that
2014,
exploit that on August
bajo los
30th,
acordes de los himnos
2014, as
nacionales
the
de
national
Cuba y los
anthems of
Estados
Cuba and the
Unidos,
United States were played,
fue condecorada con la
she
Orden
was
al
presented
Mérito Deportivo
with the Order of
otorgado por el
Sport
Consejo
Merits,
de Estado
a
cubano.
decoration awarded by the State Council.
Esta proeza
Such feat
contiene un fuerte
carries a
mensaje.
powerful message,
Debería servirnos de
one that should
ejemplo
serve as an example
para las relaciones
to our bilateral
bilaterales,
relations,
ya que confirma
for it confirms
que si ella pudo,
that if she could do it,
entonces
then
nosotros también
we
podremos.
can do it too.
Le reitero al
To
presidente
President
Obama
Obama,
nuestro
I
agradecimiento
reiterate
por
our
su
appreciation
visita
for his visit
y la voluntad del gobierno
and the
de Cuba
willingness of the government
de
of
seguir
Cuba
avanzando en los próximos
to
meses
continue moving
por el
forward
bien
in the
de
forthcoming
nuestros
months
pueblos
for the
y países.
well-being of our
Muchas
peoples and countries. Thank you very much.
Buenas tardes, President Castro, to you, the Cuban government, and the Cuban people. Thank you for the welcome that you've extended to me, to my family, and to my delegation. For more than half a century, the sight of a U.S. president here in Havana would have been unimaginable. But this is a new day. Es un nuevo día between our two countries. With your indulgence, Mr. President, I want to go just briefly off topic because during this weekend I received news that one of our outstanding outstanding United States Armed Service members, Marine Staff Sergeant Louis F. Carden of Temecula, California, was killed in northern Iraq as we assisted the Iraqi government in dealing with ISIL, the terrorist organization there. And I just wanted to give my thoughts and prayers to the family there and those who've been injured. It's a reminder that even as we embark on this historic visit, there are U.S. Armed Service members who are sacrificing each and every day on behalf of our freedom and our safety. So I'm grateful to them. My wife Michelle and I have brought our daughters. And by the way, they don't always want to go with us. They're teenagers now. They have friends at home and they have things to do, but they wanted to come to Cuba because they understood and we wanted to show them the beauty of Cuba and its people. We were moved by the Cubans who received us yesterday, smiling and waving as we drove in from the airport. We were grateful for the opportunity to experience Old Havana and some excellent Cuban food. Our visit to the cathedral was a reminder of the values that we share, the deep faith that sustains so many Cubans and Americans, and it also gave me an opportunity to express my gratitude to Cardinal Ortega, who, along with His Holiness Pope Francis, did so much to support the improved relations between our governments. This morning I was honored to pay tribute to Jose Marti, not only his role in Cuban independence, but the profound words that he wrote and spoke in support of liberty and freedom everywhere. I bring with me the greetings and the friendship of the American people. In fact, I'm joined on this trip by nearly 40 members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans. This is the largest such delegation of my presidency, and it indicates the excitement and interest in America about the process that we've undertaken. These members of Congress recognize that our new relationship with the Cuban people is in the interest of both nations. I'm also joined by some of America's top business leaders and entrepreneurs because we're ready to pursue more commercial ties which create jobs and opportunity for Cubans and Americans alike. And I'm especially pleased that I'm joined on this trip by so many Cuban Americans. For them, and for the more than 2 million proud Cuban Americans across the United States, this is a moment filled with great emotion. Ever since we made it easier to travel between our countries, more Cuban Americans are coming home. And for many, this is a time of new hope for the future. So, President Castro, I want to thank you for the courtesy and the spirit of openness that you've shown during our talks. At our meeting in Panama last year, you said that we're willing to discuss every issue and everything's on the table. So with your understanding, my statement will be a little longer than usual. President Castro always jokes with me about how long Castro brother speeches can be, but I'm going to actually go a little longer than you probably today, with your indulgence. We have a half a century of work to catch up on. Our growing engagement with Cuba is guided by one overarching goal: advancing the mutual interest of our two countries, including improving the lives of our people, both Cubans and Americans. That's why I'm here. I've said consistently, after more than 5 very difficult decades, the relationship between our governments will not be transformed overnight. We continue, as President Castro indicated, to have some very serious differences, including on democracy and human rights. And President Castro and I have had very frank and candid conversations on these subjects. The United States recognizes progress that Cuba has made as a nation, its enormous achievements in education and in healthcare. And perhaps most importantly, I affirm that Cuba's destiny will not be decided by the United States or any other nation. Cuba is sovereign and rightly has great pride, and the future of Cuba will be decided by Cubans, not by anybody else. At the same time, as we do wherever we go around the world, I made it clear that the United States will continue to speak up on behalf of democracy, including the right of the Cuban people to decide their own future. We'll speak out on behalf of universal human rights, including freedom of speech and assembly and religion. Indeed, I look forward to meeting with and hearing from Cuban civil society leaders tomorrow. But, as you heard, President Castro has also addressed what he views as shortcomings in the United States around basic needs for people and poverty and inequality and race relations. And we welcome that constructive dialogue as well, because we believe that when we share our deepest beliefs and ideas with an attitude of mutual respect, that we can both learn and make the lives of our people better. A part of normalizing relations means that we discuss these differences directly. So I'm very pleased that we've agreed to hold our next U.S.-Cuba Human Rights Dialogue here in Havana this year. And both of our countries will welcome visits by independent United Nations experts as we combat human trafficking, which we agree is a profound violation of human rights. Even as we discuss these differences, we share a belief that we can continue to make progress in those areas that we have in common. President Castro, you said in Panama that we might disagree on something today on which we would agree tomorrow. And that's certainly been the case over the past 15 months and the days leading up to this visit. And today I can report that we continue to move forward on many fronts when it comes to normalizing relations. We're moving ahead with more opportunities for Americans to travel to Cuba and interact with the Cuban people. Over the past year, the number of Americans coming here has surged. Last week, we gave approval for individual Americans to come here for educational travel. U.S. airlines will begin direct commercial flights this year. With last week's port security announcement, we've removed the last major hurdle to resuming cruises and ferry service, all of which will mean even more Americans visiting Cuba in the years ahead and appreciating the incredible history and culture of the Cuban people. We're moving ahead with more trade. With only 90 miles between us, we're natural trading partners. Other steps we took last week, allowing the U.S. dollar to be used more widely with Cuba, giving Cubans more access to the dollar in international transactions, and allowing Cubans in the U.S. to earn salaries. These things will do more to create opportunities for trade and joint ventures. We welcome Cuba's important announcement that it plans to end the 10% penalty on dollar conversions here, which will open the door to more travel and more commerce. And these steps show that we're opening up to one another. With this visit, we've agreed to deepen our cooperation on agriculture to support our farmers and our ranchers. This afternoon, I'll highlight some of the new commercial deals being announced by major U.S. companies. And just as I continue to call on Congress to lift the trade embargo, I discussed with President Castro the steps we urge Cuba to take to show that it's ready to do more business, which includes allowing more joint ventures and allowing foreign companies to hire Cubans directly. We're moving ahead with our efforts to help connect more Cubans to the internet and the global economy. Under President Castro, Cuba's set a goal of bringing Cubans online, and we want to help. At this afternoon's entrepreneurship event, I'll discuss additional steps we're taking to help more Cubans learn, innovate, and do business online, because in the 21st century, countries cannot be successful unless their citizens have access to the internet. We're moving ahead with more educational exchanges. Thanks to the generous support of the Cuban American community, I can announce that my 100,000 Strong in the Americas initiative will offer new opportunities for university students to study abroad, more Americans at Cuban schools, and more Cubans at U.S. schools. And going forward, educational grants and scholarships will be available to Cuban students. And in partnership with the Cuban government, we'll offer more English language training for Cuban teachers, both in Cuba and online. Even as Cubans prepare for the arrival of the Rolling Stones, we're moving ahead with more exchanges that bring Cubans and Americans together as well. We all look forward to tomorrow's matchup between the Tampa Bay Rays and the Cuban national team. More broadly, we're moving ahead with partnerships in health, science, and the environment. Just as Cubans and American medical teams have worked together in Haiti against cholera and in West Africa against Ebola, and I want to give a special commendation to Cuban doctors who volunteered and took on some very tough assignments to save lives in West Africa in partnership with us and other nations. We very much appreciate the work that they did. Our medical professionals will now collaborate in new areas, preventing the spread of viruses like Zika and leading new research into cancer vaccines. Our governments will also work together to protect the beautiful waters of this region that we share. And as two countries threatened by climate change, I believe we can work together to protect communities in our low-lying coasts. And we're inviting Cuba to join us and our Caribbean and Central American partners at this spring's Regional Energy Summit in Washington. And finally, we're moving ahead with our closer cooperation on regional security. We're working to deepen our law enforcement coordination, especially against narco-traffickers that threaten both of our peoples. I want to thank President Castro and the Cuban government for hosting peace talks between the Colombian government and the FARC. And we remain optimistic that Colombians can achieve a lasting and just peace. And although we did not have an extensive discussion of Venezuela, we did touch on the subject. And I believe that the whole region has an interest in a country that is addressing its economic challenges, is responsive to the aspirations of its people, and is a source of stability in the region. That is, I believe, an interest that we should all share. So again, President Castro, I want to thank you for welcoming me. I think it's fair to say that the United States and Cuba are now engaged across more areas than any time during my lifetime. And with every passing day, more Americans are coming to Cuba, more U.S. businesses and schools and faith groups are working to forge new partnerships with the Cuban people. More Cubans are benefiting from the opportunities that this travel and trade bring. As you indicated, the road ahead will not be easy. Fortunately, we don't have to swim with sharks in order to achieve the goals that you and I have set forth. As you say here in Cuba, echar para adelante. Despite the difficulties, we will continue to move forward. We're focused on the future, and I'm absolutely confident that if we stay on this course, we can deliver a better and brighter future for both the Cuban people and the American people. So, muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Pasamos ahora a una breve sesión de
Now
preguntas
we'll
y
have a
respuestas.
short
Ruego a los
Q&A
periodistas
session, so I kindly ask
identificarse y
the
hacer uso
journalists
de
to
los
identify
micrófonos
themselves
ubicados
and
en la
use
sala.
the mics
Una
that
primera
are in
pregunta
the
al
room.
presidente
A
Barack
first
Obama.
question for President Barack Obama.
First question, Jim Costa.
Gracias, President Castro.
Thank you,
su
President
hospitalidad
Castro, for your
en La Habana.
hospitality here in
And,
Havana.
thank you, Mr. President. In your meeting with President Castro, what words did you use to urge him to pursue democratic reforms and expand human rights here in Cuba? Will you invite President Castro to the White House? We know he's been to New York. And why did you not meet with Fidel Castro? And President Castro, mi padre es cubano.
My father
se
is
fue para
Cuban.
los Estados
He
Unidos
left for
cuando
the United
era
States when he was very young.
My father's Cuban.
My father
He
is
left for the United States when he was young. Ve una dirección nueva y
This is
democrática
a new
para su
democratic
país.
direction
You
for
see a
your
new
country.
and democratic direction for your country. Y, por favor, señor, ¿por qué
And
tiene
please, sir,
prisioneros
why
políticos
do you have
cubanos?
Cuban political
Why do you have
prisoners?
Cuban political
Why
prisoners?
do you have,
¿Y por qué no los
and
suelta?
why don't you release them?
Y, por favor, una pregunta
And
más.
another
¿A
last
quién
question.
prefiere? Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump?
Who do you prefer, Hillary Clinton or Donald
Gracias.
Trump? Thank you.
Well, as I think we both indicated, we had a very frank conversation around issues of democracy and human rights. Our starting point is that we have two different systems of government, economies, and we have decades of profound differences, both bilaterally and internationally. What I have said to President Castro is that we are moving forward and not looking backwards, that we don't view Cuba as a threat to the United States. I hope that my visit here indicates the degree to which we're setting a new chapter in Cuban-American relations. But as is true with countries around the world where we have normalized relations, we will continue to stand up for basic principles that we believe in. America believes in democracy. We believe that freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion are not just American values, but are universal values. They may not express themselves exactly in the same way in every country. They may not be enshrined in the founding documents or constitutions of every country the same way or protected legally in exactly the same ways, but the impulse, the human impulse towards freedom, the freedom that Jose Marti talked about, we think is a universal longing. President Castro, I think, has pointed out that in his view, making sure that everybody's getting a decent education or health care, has basic security in old age, that those things are human rights as well. I personally would not disagree with that. But it doesn't detract from some of these other concerns. And the goal of the human rights dialogue is not for the United States to dictate to Cuba how they should govern themselves, but to make sure that we are having a frank and candid conversation around this issue, and hopefully that we can learn from each other. It does not mean that it has to be the only issue we talk about. Economics, health, scientific exchanges, international cooperation on issues of regional as well as global import are also important. But this is something that we are going to stay on. And, you know, I actually welcome President Castro commenting on some of the areas where he feels that we're falling short, because I think we should not be immune or afraid of criticism or discussion as well. Here's the one thing I do know, is that when I talk to Cuban Americans, and Jim, you're second generation, and so I think I speak not for you directly, but for many that I talk to around the United States. I think there's enormous hope that there can be reconciliation, and the bridge that President Castro discussed can be built between the Cuban American community and Cubans here. There are family ties and cultural ties that are so strong, and I think everyone would benefit from those ties being reestablished. One of the impediments to strengthening those ties is these disagreements around human rights and democracy. And to the extent that we can have a good conversation about that and to actually make progress, that I think will allow us to see the full flowering of a relationship that is possible. In the absence of that, I think it will continue to be a very powerful irritant. And you know, this is not unique to U.S.-Cuban relations. It's one that, as you know, I have conversations with when we go to bilateral meetings with some of our very close allies, as well as countries that we don't have as close of a relationship to. But I think it is something that that matters. And I've met with people who've been subject to arbitrary detention, and That's something that I generally have to speak out on because I hear from them directly and I know what it means for them. But, excuse me.
¿Ya?
Yeah, what?
Estaba preguntando
I was
si se
asking
dirigió a mí porque
if
las
he
primeras
was,
palabras no las entendí.
he, if his question was
Oír
directed
que
to me or
habló
to
de
President
presos
Obama.
humanos.
You
The second
talked
one was
about, no,
addressed to you.
you talked about political prisoners.
Ah, parece.
And Trump and Hillary.
¿Para a quién?
I
¿A
can't
él
comment
o
on
a mí?
For him or for me?
Para su, señor Presidente Castro.
¿Qué dijo de los presos
For you,
políticos?
President Castro, what did you say about political
¿Qué
prisoners?
pregunta
Can you
concreta
repeat
hizo de los
that
presos
question about political prisoners?
Si hay presos políticos.
Did you ask if we had political
Preguntó
prisoners?
si hay presos
Did you
políticos.
ask if we had political prisoners?
Políticos cubanos.
I wanted to know if you have Cuban
Está
political
bien, es la
prisoners.
única que te voy a permitir.
And why you don't
Dame la
release
lista
them.
ahora
Well,
mismo de los
give
presos
me a
políticos
list
para
of the
soltarlos.
political prisoners and I will release them
Menciónala
immediately.
ahora.
Just mention a
¿Qué
list.
preso político?
What
Dime el
political
nombre.
prisoners? Give me
O
a
los
name
nombres.
or names.
O cuando concluya la
Or
reunión me da
when
una lista de los
after this
presos.
meeting is over, you can give
Y
me
si
a
hay
list
esos
of
presos políticos,
political
antes de
prisoners.
que llegue la
And if
noche,
we
van a
have
estar
those
sueltos.
political prisoners, they will
Ya.
be released before
Una
tonight ends.
pregunta,
Y Donald
Una-
Trump o Hillary Clinton, President Castro.
And what
una
about
pregunta
your
al presidente
preference for
Raúl. Boris.
Saludos para el presidente Obama y
my
Para el
Yo
greetings
presidente-
for
todavía
President
no
Obama?
puedo votar en los Estados Unidos.
Well, I cannot vote in the United States.
¿Cómo?
una pregunta para el
My
presidente
question
Raúl
is
Castro,
for
Boris Fuentes,
President Raul
de
Castro. My
la
name is
televisión
Boris Frente.
cubana.
I'm from
Presidente
the
Raúl Castro,
Cuban
usted ha dicho
TV.
en
President Raul
reiteradas
Castro, you
ocasiones
have
y hoy
repeatedly
lo ha
stated,
repetido una vez más
and
aquí,
today
debemos
once again,
aprender a
that we
convivir
must learn to
civilizadamente
coexist in a
con
civilized
nuestras
manner
diferencias.
with our
¿Podría usted ampliarnos
differences.
ese
Could
concepto
you
en este momento histórico que está
broaden
viviendo
this
Cuba?
concept
También de paso,
at this
una pregunta
historical
pequeña para el
moment
presidente
that
Barack
we are
Obama.
living? And then I have a
Presidente
brief
Obama,
question for President
¿podría el
Obama.
gobierno de Estados
President
Unidos
Obama,
dar mayores
could
pasos
U.S.
para
government
eliminar el
give more
bloqueo
space to
de Estados
eliminate
Unidos
the
durante
U.S.
su gobierno
blockade
y
during
no
your
tendría que
mandate
vivir una generación
so
más de cubanos
that
bajo
another
este bloqueo
generation of
económico
Cubans would not
financiero
have to
contra Cuba?
suffer this economic and commercial blockade against Cuba?
Para mí fue la primera.
The first question
sea,
was for me.
Repite tu pregunta que no pude.
Please repeat your question because I couldn't hear well.
Usted ha dicho en reiteradas
You
ocasiones,
have said repeatedly
hoy lo ha repetido otra vez, debemos aprender a
that
convivir
we must learn to
civilizadamente con nuestras
coexist in a
diferencias.
civilized manner with our
Y en
differences.
el propio
Well,
presidente Obama se ha estado
President Obama himself
refiriéndose.
has
Hemos dado los
referred to
primeros
that.
pasos.
We have given the first steps,
Bastante para ser los
many
primeros.
for being
Y
the
debemos
first
continuar
steps, and we
dando
must
esos pasos.
continue
Y estoy
giving
seguro
these steps. And I'm sure
de que
that
lograremos
we will
convivir
be able to
pacíficamente en
coexist
un ambiente
peacefully
de
in
colaboración
an environment
mutua,
of
como ya lo
mutual
estamos haciendo
cooperation
en algunos
as
aspectos,
we are doing
en
already in
beneficio de
many
ambos
fields
países,
for the
en
benefit of both
beneficio de
countries
otros países,
and for the benefit
como
of
ya
other
lo hemos
countries
hecho
as we have
modestamente en
already
Haití,
done
cuando el
in
cólera,
Haiti when the
y en
cholera
África con el ébola,
and
como él
in
se refirió,
Africa with the Ebola.
y que es el futuro de la humanidad si
That is the
queremos
future of
salvar la
mankind if
especie.
we want to save the
Aunque el
human
agua siga
species.
creciendo
Though
y
the
la isla
water
se realiza.
grows and or the level of water grows and the island
Muchas
may become
preguntas para mí.
smaller.
Yo
That
creo
is
que las preguntas hay que hacerse al
you are making
presidente
too much
Obama.
questions,
Obama, por
too many
favor.
questions
Ahí
to me.
está
I
el
think
regulador.
questions should be directed to President
I've got one more.
Obama.
So, we have administratively already made a number of modifications on the embargo. I referred to a number of them in my opening statement. And we've actually been fairly aggressive in exercising as much flexibility as we can, given that the law putting the embargo in place has not been repealed by Congress. There may be some technical aspects of the embargo that we can still make adjustments on, depending on problems as they arise. So, for example, the issue around the dollar and the need to make modifications in terms of how the embargo was implemented to encourage rather than discourage reforms that the Cuban government itself is willing to engage in and to facilitate greater trade and commerce. That is something that grew out of the dialogue between our governments, and we have made appropriate adjustments to it. It will take some time for commercial banks to understand the new rules, but we actually think that this is an area where we can improve current circumstances. But I'll be honest with you that the list of things that we can do administratively is growing shorter. And the bulk of changes that have to be made with respect to the embargo are now going to rely on Congress making changes. I've been very clear about the interest in getting that done before I leave. Frankly, Congress is not as productive as I would like during presidential election years. But the fact that we have such a large congressional delegation with Democrats and Republicans with us is an indication that there is growing interest inside of Congress for lifting the embargo. As I just indicated in my earlier answer, how quickly that happens will in part depend on whether we can bridge some of our differences around human rights issues, and that's why the dialogue, I think, is so important. It sends a signal that at least there's engagement between the two countries on these matters. Okay. Now, I promised the President I would take one more question. Andrea Mitchell of NBC. Andrea, if you can get the mic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Do you feel after your meetings today that you have made enough progress to even accelerate the pace, and that the Cuban government is able to move quickly enough so that the changes that you have made through these technical adjustments to the embargo will be permanent, cannot be reversed by the next president? And what advice have you given to President Castro about the ability of having the blockade, the embargo lifted? Because he has said again today, this is a continuous issue which is blocking progress from their standpoint. And you said the conversations about human rights were frank and candid, and that you want to move forward. But even as you were arriving, there were dramatic arrests of peaceful protests, the ladies in white. What signal does that send? Can you have civilized coexistence at the same time you have such profound disagreements about the very definitions of what human rights means, as President Castro expressed today? And for President Castro, for many of us, it's remarkable to hear you speak about all of these subjects. Could you tell us what you see in the future? President Obama has 9 months remaining. You have said you would be stepping down in 2018. What is the future of our two countries, given the different definitions and the different interpretations of profound issues like democracy and human rights? Thank you.
Well, Andrea, the embargo is going to end. When? I can't be entirely sure, but I believe it will end, and the path that we're on will continue beyond my administration. The reason is logical. The reason is that what we did for 50 years did not serve our interests or the interests of the Cuban people. And as I said when we made the announcement about normalization of relations, if you keep on doing something over and over again for 50 years and it doesn't work, it might make sense to try something new. And that's what we've done. And the fact that there has been strong support, not just inside of Congress, not just among the American people, but also among the Cuban people, indicates that this is a process that should and will continue. Having said that, lifting the embargo requires the votes of a majority in Congress and maybe even more than a majority in the Senate. And as I indicated to President Castro, two things I think will help accelerate the pace of bringing the embargo to an end. The first is, to the degree that we can take advantage of the existing changes that we've already made, and we see progress, that will help to validate this change in policy. So, for example, we have said that it is no longer a restriction on U.S. companies to invest in helping to build internet and broadband infrastructure inside of Cuba. It is not against U.S. law, as it's been interpreted by the administration. If we start seeing those kinds of commercial deals taking place, and Cubans are benefiting from greater access to the internet, and when I go to the entrepreneurship meeting later this afternoon, I understand that we're going to meet some young Cubans who are already getting trained and are facile and using the internet and interested in startups. That builds a constituency for ending the embargo. If we build on the work that we're doing in agriculture, and you start seeing more U.S. farmers interacting with Cuban farmers, and there's more exports and imports, that builds a constituency, and the possibility of ending the embargo increases. So hopefully taking advantage of what we've already done will help. And the second area, which we've already discussed extensively, is the issue of human rights. People are still concerned about that inside of Cuba. Now, keep in mind, I've got fierce disagreements with the Chinese around human rights. I'll be going to Vietnam later this year. I have deep disagreements with them as well. When we first visited Burma, people questioned whether we should be traveling there because of long-standing human rights violations in our view. And the approach that I've taken has been that if I engage, frankly, clearly, stating what our beliefs are, but also being clear that we can't force change on any particular country. Ultimately, it has to come from within. Then that is going to be a more useful strategy than the same kinds of rigid disengagement that for 50 years did nothing. I guess ultimately what this comes down to, Andreas, I have faith in people. I think that if you meet Cubans here and Cubans meet Americans and they're meeting and talking and interacting and doing business together and going to school together and learning from each other, then they'll recognize people are people. And in that context, I believe that change will occur.
President Castro.
Okay, now I'm done, but Senor Presidente, I think Andrea had a question for you just about your vision. It's up to you. He did say he was only going to take one question. I was going to take two, but I leave it up to you if you want to address that question.
Por favor.
Andrea's, she's one of our most esteemed journalists in America, and I'm sure she'd appreciate just a short, brief answer.
Andrea,
Mr. President.
Andrea,
el otro día hice una pregunta.
the
al
other
canciller
day I
nuestro.
asked a question to our foreign minister,
Andrea,
Andrea,
le están preguntando a usted, pero tenemos que concluir.
but
Hay un programa.
there is a program here
Yo sé que
to
si me
be
quedo que
fulfilled.
hacen
I
500
know
preguntas.
that if
Yo
I
dije
stay
que iba a
here, you'll
contestar
make
una. Voy a contestar
questions.
una y
I
media.
said that I was going to answer one.
Ya el
Well, I'll
presidente
answer one
Obama
and
me
a half.
ayudó.
I don't wanna break
President
the deal.
Obama
Me
has
ayudó con
already
la
helped me out
respuesta.
with the answer.
Andrea,
Here,
es usted.
Andrea.
Bien,
Well,
Andrea.
Andrea.
Yo leí algo aquí de
I
lo
was
que pienso de los
reading
derechos humanos,
here
pero ahora soy yo el
something
que le voy a hacer
I
una
think
pregunta a
about
usted.
human rights, but I'm going to make the question to you now.
En las instituciones ya reconocido hay
In
40 y cuántos, 40
There are 40.
de sí,
There are
instrumentos internacionales.
61 international
¿Cuántos
instruments
países,
recognized.
Andrea, del
How
mundo
many
cumplen los
countries in the world
61
comply
derechos humanos?
with
Eso,
all
señora
the
Rodríguez,
human
y
rights and civil rights that have been
su
included
conjunto.
in these 61
¿Qué país
instruments?
los cumple
What
todos?
country complies with them all?
¿Lo sabe usted?
Do you know how many?
Yo sí.
I do.
Ninguno.
None.
Ninguno. Unos
None
cumplen unos,
whatsoever.
otros
Some
cumplen
countries
otros.
comply some
Y
rights,
entre esos
others
estamos
comply
nosotros.
others. And
De
we
esos
are among
mencionados,
these
61
countries.
son.
Out of these
Cuba
61
cumple
instruments,
47.
Cuba has complied with 47
Habrá
of
otros que
these
cumplan
human
más,
rights
y muchos
instruments.
que cumplan
There are
menos.
countries that may
No
comply
se
with
puede
more,
politizar
those
el
that comply
tema
with
de los
less.
derechos
I
humanos.
think human rights issues should not be politicized.
Eso no es correcto.
That is not correct.
Si se persigue con esos fines, vamos a
If
seguir con lo mismo.
that is the purpose, then
Por
we
ejemplo,
will
para Cuba, que no lo cumple todo,
stay the same way.
el
Like,
derecho
for
a la
example,
salud. ¿Usted
for
quiere algo,
Cuba,
algo
that
un
does not
derecho más
fulfill
sagrado
all
que el
the
derecho a la
rights.
salud?
Do you think there is any
Que no
other
se
more
mueran,
sacred
que no se
right
mueran
than the right to
millones y
health,
millones de
so that
niños
billions
por
of
falta de
children
una
don't
simple
die
vacuna,
just
por
for the
cualquier
lack of a
medicina?
vaccine or a drug or a medicament?
Por ejemplo,
For example,
¿usted está de acuerdo con el
do you
derecho a la
agree
enseñanza
with
gratuita
the
para
right
todos
to
los
free
nacidos en
education
cualquier país?
for all those born anywhere in the
Creo que hay
world
muchos
or in
países
any
que no
country?
consideran
I
eso un
think
derecho
many
humano.
countries don't
En
think
Cuba,
this is a human right.
empezando que
In
todos
Cuba,
los niños nacen en
all
hospital y ese
children
mismo
are
primer día
born
son
in a
inscritos.
hospital and they are registered
Porque
that
cuando
same
las
day.
madres están en un
Because
estado
when
avanzado
mothers
de su
are
embarazo,
in
se
an
les
advanced
conduce a los
pregnancy,
hospitales
they
muchos días antes
they
o en
go to
algunas casas
hospitals
o locales
days
adjuntos,
before,
muchos días antes del parto para
many
que
days
todos
before
nazcan
delivery,
en
so
hospitales.
that all
No
children
importa en qué isla la
are
montaña
born
vivan
in
y su
hospitals. It
condición
doesn't matter if they live in faraway places or in
Tenemos también
mountains or hills.
otros muchos
We
derechos.
have many other rights.
Derecho a la salud,
A right to health,
derecho a la enseñanza.
the right to education.
Usted considera, por ejemplo, el último
Do
ejemplo que
you,
le voy a
and
sacar,
this is my last example
o le voy a exponer.
that I will mention.
¿Usted cree que
Do you think
por un trabajo igual
that
un hombre gane más que una mujer
for
solo por
equal
ser mujer?
work, men get better paid than women just for the fact of
Pues,
being
la
a
mujer
woman?
gana
Well, in Cuba,
igual
women
que el hombre
get
si hace igual
same
trabajo.
pay for
Le puedo
same work.
enumerar decenas y
I can
cientos.
give you
Así que
many,
no se puede estar
many
utilizando
examples. So
ese
I don't think
argumento.
we cannot use the argument of
Pienso yo en la confrontación política
human
que no es
rights
justa,
for
no es
political
correcta.
confrontation. That is not
No
fair.
quiero
It's not
decir que no es
correct.
honesto,
I'm
eso
not
forma
saying that
parte
it's
de
not
las
honest. It's part of
confrontaciones.
confrontations,
Vamos a
of
trabajar
course.
para que
But let
todos
us
podamos
work so
cumplir
that we
todos
can
los derechos
all
humanos.
comply with all
Eso
human
es así.
rights.
Igual que hablar de precios.
It's
Esto va a
like
terminar
talking
porque
about
tengo
prices,
compromiso
and I'm going to end here because there is a commitment that we should
puntual.
end in time.
No es correcto
It's
por
not
preguntarnos por presos
to
políticos. Dígame el
Ask
nombre del
me
preso
about
político.
political prisoners in general. Please give me the name of a
Y ya.
political prisoner.
Hemos
And I think with
concluido.
this
Muchas gracias a todos
is
por la
enough.
participación.
We have concluded. Thank you for your participation.